Those who look outward, dream. Those who look inward, awaken. Carl Jung. These words by Carl Jung carry a truth that many avoid facing. We spend so much time looking for answers outside, in the approval of others, in the goals we've been told we should achieve, in the roles we've learned to play, that we forget to ask, what, in fact, are we building inside? And that's where the discomfort begins. Sometimes it comes as a subtle unease, a feeling that, although everything seems right, something is missing. At other times, it's more brutal, a deep emptiness in the middle of a life that should be perfect. No wonder so many of us are afraid of silence, because it's in the silence that we hear the hardest questions. Am I living the life I really want? Or am I just following a script that isn't mine? These doubts don't appear by chance. They are signs, little reminders that perhaps we are living on autopilot, disconnected from who we really are. And this doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, almost invisible process that starts back when we learn that in order to be loved, we need to be accepted. Society teaches us to wear masks, not to deceive, but to adapt. From an early age, we are shaped by the expectations of others. What to wear, how to speak, what to dream. We create a version of ourselves that the world approves of, but which often suffocates us. And what happens to everything we let go of to fit into this mold? It doesn't disappear. It stays stored away, repressed, hidden in a dark corner inside us. Carl Jung called it the shadow. It's the part of ourselves that we avoid looking at, the fears, the insecurities, the desires that we've been taught to reject. But what if these parts were precisely the path to self-knowledge? Perhaps the discomfort we feel is not a problem, but an invitation. Perhaps the cracks in our lives are not something to be repaired, but an opportunity for transformation. And that's what we're talking about here. It's not about simply changing careers or ending a relationship. It's something deeper, awakening to who you really are. Because it's only when we integrate all the parts of ourselves, the masks we wear, the shadows we hide, that we can find a true purpose. But how to do that? How do we free ourselves from our ties, face what we avoid, and finally live authentically? The answers aren't easy, and they don't come from outside. They are inside you, waiting to be discovered. From the time we are children, we learn that in order to be accepted, we need to fit in. We shape our behavior based on what is expected of us. We smile even when we're sad. We say thank you when we don't feel grateful. We hide what we think to avoid conflict. This polished version that we show the world is what Carl Jung called the persona, the social mask. It's useful, it protects us, helps us navigate life and build connections. But over time, this mask stops being just a tool and becomes a prison. We start to confuse the version we show the world with who we really are. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Hell is other people." Not because people are bad, but because in order to be accepted, we constantly adjust who we are to meet their expectations. And the further we move away from our essence, the heavier it becomes to carry that mask. It's easy to spot when this happens. It's those moments when you find yourself acting on automatic, saying yes when you mean no, or feeling empty, even when everything in your life seems to be in place. You know what's funny? We often don't even realize we're wearing this mask until it starts to crack. Let me tell you the story of my friend Anna. Anna was always the person who did everything right. She got the best grades at school, chose a respectable career, and at the age of 34, had a top position in a large company. Her parents loved to tell her about their daughter's success, and her friends admired her for her determination. But when no one was looking, Anna felt something different. The work that seemed so incredible to others was suffocating for her. Every day, she sat at her desk, stared at her computer, and felt like she was wasting her life. At night, lying in bed, she wondered, is this it? Is this what my life will be like? She carried this feeling alone, until one day, over coffee with a friend, she heard something that disconcerted her. The friend said, "You have everything you ever wanted. It must be nice to live like that." At that moment, Anna felt the uncontrollable urge to shout, "I don't have anything I want. Everything you see, I built to please others." But she didn't say anything. She just smiled, put another layer on her mask, and changed the subject. What Anna didn't know was that what she was feeling was an invitation. That emptiness, that feeling of disconnection, were not problems to be ignored. They were cracks in the mask, signs that it was time to stop and look inside. Because that's how the mask works. At first it protects us, but over time it starts to weigh us down. It shapes who we are to the point where we no longer recognize our own essence. This disconnection between the real self and the social self has profound consequences. Psychoanalyst Karen Horney calls it the dissonance between the real self and the ideal self. According to her, when we distance ourselves from who we really are in order to meet external expectations, we end up creating a cycle of dissatisfaction and anxiety. Studies also show that this disconnection can manifest itself as symptoms of burnout or even existential crises. The more we ignore our true selves, the harder it becomes to maintain the mask. As Carl Jung emphasized, it is essential that each individual seeks to realize their true self, rather than conforming to external expectations. But what happens to everything we put aside to keep the mask intact? It doesn't disappear. It stays stored, hidden, repressed in a dark corner inside us. Carl Jung called this part the shadow. And this is where the real challenge begins, dealing with what we hide. Facing these parts that we avoid is painful, but it's also the way to free ourselves. Is this content making you reflect and sparking new ways of thinking? If so, click the super thanks button just below the video. It's a way to say thank you and help me bring more content like this to those who need to reflect on life. Behind every mask we wear, there is a hidden territory, a part of us that we prefer not to see. Fears, insecurities, desires we think are inadequate. Everything we repress in order to fit into the world. Carl Jung called this the shadow. The shadow is everything we learn to hide because we were taught it was wrong. From an early age, we hear phrases like, "Don't cry, that's weakness. Don't be angry, be a good person." And so, little by little, we began to push parts of ourselves into a dark corner, believing that if we didn't see them, they would disappear. But that never happens. Jung said, "Until you become conscious, the unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it destiny." In other words, everything we ignore in ourselves continues to act silently, shaping our choices, our behavior, and even our failures. If you've never seen Black Swan, let me explain why it's such a powerful metaphor for the shadow. The movie tells the story of Nina, a young ballerina obsessed with being perfect. Her goal is to star in the ballet Swan Lake, playing both the delicate white swan and the intense black swan. From the start, we see that Nina represses almost everything that doesn't fit the image of the good girl. Her desires, her anger, her sexuality. She is controlled by her mother, who projects onto her the dreams she hasn't fulfilled. Nina does everything right. She's disciplined, hardworking, impeccable. But to play the black swan, she needs to access a darker side of herself, something she has always ignored. And that's where the conflict begins. As she forces herself to explore this side, things she has repressed for years begin to surface. Anger, impulses, desires. Everything that was hidden in the shadows explodes out of control. The line between what is real and what is imagined blurs, and Nina loses herself in her own psyche. The final scene of the movie is a brilliant example of this. Facing her own shadow, Nina finally delivers the perfect performance, but at great cost. She realizes that her obsessive quest for perfection and her desire to please others have taken her completely away from herself. Black Swan shows us that the shadow doesn't disappear simply because we ignore it. On the contrary, the more we repress it, the stronger it becomes. The shadow is not a monster to be destroyed, but a part of us that needs to be integrated. From a psychological point of view, the shadow is a metaphor for the unconscious. It is the depository of everything we reject about ourselves. According to Jung, the shadow is made up of characteristics that we have learned to consider unacceptable, such as weakness, anger, or insecurity. But ignoring these aspects has profound consequences. Clinical psychologist Connie Zweig, author of Meeting the Shadow, says that by denying our shadow, we lose part of our vital energy. She explains that when we accept our shadow, we can channel these repressed energies in a constructive way. For example, by recognizing our anger, we can transform it into assertiveness. In practice, this means paying attention to our emotional triggers. When we feel anger, envy, or discomfort, it's a sign that there's something deeper going on. Acknowledging these feelings without judgment is the first step towards illuminating the shadow. Philosophy also has a lot to say about the dark aspects of the human soul. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, addressed the idea of integrating the dark side in his work Thus spoke Zarathustra. He spoke of the importance of accepting the chaos within us as a creative force. Nietzsche said, "You have to have chaos inside you to give birth to a dancing star." For Nietzsche, the shadow is not a problem to be solved, but an essential part of what makes us human. To ignore this chaos is to condemn ourselves to a superficial life, disconnected from our true potential. Confronting the shadow is not easy. It means giving up the idea of perfection and accepting our imperfections. But as we saw in Nina's example, not facing this side can be even more destructive. The path to freedom begins by illuminating what we avoid. And only by integrating light and shadow can we find who we really are. But what happens when we finally accept all parts of ourselves? That's the beginning of awakening. Awakening is not a magical moment. It's not like finding a ready-made answer or turning on a light that transforms everything instantly. It's a process, a journey that begins when we have the courage to look inside and confront the truths we've been avoiding. Imagine a seed. Inside it is all the potential to become a tree. But for that to happen, something has to happen. The shell must break. It has to face the darkness of the earth, the weight of the soil, the cold, the humidity. Only then can it grow and reach the light. We are like that seed. We carry within us everything we need to flourish, but we often get stuck in our shell. The mask we wear, the shadows we hide, the expectations we carry. Awakening begins exactly when these layers start to crack. And when they crack, something painful happens. You realize that there are parts of your life that no longer make sense. Perhaps the job you fought so hard to get no longer reflects your values. Or that relationship that seemed perfect no longer has room for the person you are becoming. These discoveries are liberating, but they also bring pain. Because by following your truth, you can disappoint people, break ties, or abandon dreams that were never really yours. Living authentically is a lonely road. Not because you need to be alone, but because no one can decide for you what is right or wrong. It's your journey, and that's scary. Imagine someone who finally decides to change careers after years in a job that brings them security but no joy. Or someone who chooses to end a relationship, even though they know they will be judged for it. These decisions require courage. They force us to abandon the comfort of certainties and navigate uncertainty. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why for living can endure almost anyhow." Finding your why is what gives meaning to your actions, even when the path seems uncertain. But that doesn't mean it will be easy. Deciding to live according to your values requires facing doubts, fears, and often the resistance of those around you. Consider the story of Viktor Frankl, author of In Search of Meaning. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian doctor specializing in neurology and psychiatry. At the height of his career, he was deported to a Nazi concentration camp with his family. Frankl lost almost everything: his wife, his parents, his siblings. He lived in absolute misery, facing hunger, violence, and imminent death on a daily basis. In the midst of this horror, Frankl began to observe how people reacted to extreme suffering. He realized that, even in the most inhuman conditions, there was something that no one could take away: the meaning that each person gave to their life. He said, "Everything can be taken away from a man, except one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance." Frankl saw prisoners who, even though hungry and exhausted, shared their piece of bread with others. He saw people who, even on the brink of death, found the strength to console their cellmates. And he realized that what differentiated those who survived emotionally from those who succumbed was purpose. Frankl found purpose even in his own suffering. He began to imagine how he could use that experience to help other people. He visualized himself, after the war, giving lectures on how to find meaning in pain. This purpose helped him endure and gave meaning to his daily struggle. After his release, Frankl wrote the book In Search of Meaning, in which he shared his observations. He explained that the meaning of life is not something fixed or universal. It is something that each person needs to discover for themselves, especially in times of adversity. He said, "Man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but recognize that it is he who is questioned by life. In other words, it's not a question of waiting for answers from the world, but of deciding, at each moment, how you are going to respond to circumstances. But how do you align your choices with the truth you have discovered? Start small. Look at your daily decisions. How many of them are connected to what you really value? If you could eliminate everything that isn't meaningful, what would be left? This alignment takes practice. It requires saying no when you've always said yes. It requires the courage to be honest with yourself and others. And above all, it requires patience. You didn't build the life you have now overnight, nor will you transform it all at once. As we begin to live authentically, we realize something incredible. Our actions have an impact that goes beyond us. Each choice in line with our values is like a stone thrown into a pond. It creates waves that touch the people around us, and that, in ways we may never see, shape the world. But the awakening doesn't end there. Because when you connect with who you are, new questions arise. If every action leaves a mark, what kind of impact are you creating? How can you turn your authenticity into something that inspires, helps, and transforms the world around you? Legacy. This word sounds grandiose, something reserved for historical figures, immortal artists, or leaders who have changed the world. But what if I told you that legacy isn't about statues erected or books written? That it's not in monuments, but in people. In the stories we create, in the connections we cultivate, and in the impact we leave in every little action of everyday life. Legacy is rarely great. It's not in the things we leave behind, but in the people we touch, in the choices we make every day, in the words we say, and the gestures that seem insignificant but can transform someone's life. Seneca said, "Life is long enough if you know how to live it. But are we living it in a way that really matters? Or are we so busy chasing goals that we forget the impact we leave along the way?" Think of someone who has made a difference in your life. It may have been a teacher who believed in you, even when you doubted yourself. A friend who listened to you at the right time. Or even a person who, with their courage to be authentic, inspired you to do the same. The impact of these people didn't come from something great. It came from choices made in everyday life, from the way they decided to live. As I mentioned before, by taking off the mask and facing the shadow, we begin to awaken to who we are. And this awakening gives us enormous freedom, but it also brings with it a responsibility to live according to what we discover. Because authenticity isn't just about connecting with yourself. It's about how that connection is reflected in the world around you. Finding your why is what transforms your daily choices into something meaningful. And when you live according to that why, you realize that your every action creates ripples. Every word, every decision, every gesture shapes the impact you leave on the world. What about you? What choices are you making right now? How many of them are connected to what really matters to you? As I mentioned before, awakening is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of an authentic life, a life in which your actions begin to reflect your deepest values. And it is from this authenticity that impact is born. So let me ask you, what are you leaving behind? How are your choices impacting the people around you? Because in the end, true legacy isn't about material achievements or public recognition. It's about living in a way that inspires, transforms, and connects. It's about planting seeds that grow, even when you're no longer there to see them. Life begins when we find ourselves, but it gains meaning when we use it to transform the world around us. And remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the white rabbit.